Jesus said, "Love others as you love yourself." But the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan asked a difficult question. How can we love others if we don't love ourselves? Maybe because society can be so cruel to us, and we are so cruel to ourselves, we treat others with the same cruelty we show ourselves. Today, we're talking about Coralie Fargeat's intense psychological horror film, The Substance. Now, this movie isn't just creepy or gross. It's an intense look at our deepest insecurities, how we see ourselves, the pain society inflicts, and the devastating lengths we'll go to when self-hatred takes control. The film centres on Elisabeth Sparkle, brilliantly portrayed by Demi, a once beloved Hollywood star whose entire career implodes simply because she's aged beyond society's ruthless beauty standards. When Elisabeth is brutally dismissed from her fitness show, her producer coldly declaring, "After 50, it stops," we deeply feel the harm that society's expectations have caused. Desperate, broken, and fearful of irrelevance, Elisabeth turns to the substance, a shadowy biotech drug enabling her to create Sue, a younger, idealized version of herself, strikingly performed by Margaret Qualley. But the miraculous transformation demands a terrible price. Elisabeth must painfully extract fluid from her spine every 7 days to sustain Sue's existence, or face terrifying consequences. At its heart, The Substance explores self-alienation. Elisabeth literally splits herself in two, embodying the psychoanalytic idea of self-rejection, preferring a socially idealized identity over authenticity. Freud would recognize Sue as Elisabeth's critical doppelganger, representing her hidden desires and shame she feels inside. Their toxic bond is like the damaging pattern of addiction. Sue enjoys pleasures right away, while Elisabeth endures the painful aftermath. The psychological horror of Elisabeth's internal battle becomes brutally externalized through intense body horror imagery. The repulsive spinal fluid extraction, Sue's decaying fingers, and their monstrous fusion bring to mind Lacan's idea of the real, the unspeakable trauma of aging and societal rejection destroying how we built our idea of who we are. At the heart of this movie is something psychologists call the divided self. Basically, everyone has parts of themselves they love and parts they wish they could change. We all have parts of ourselves we embrace and parts we reject. But Elisabeth takes this division to a literal extreme by creating Sue. Think about how often you've had thoughts like, "I hate how I look in photos. Why can't I be more like someone else? If only I were younger, thinner, prettier." These thoughts reflect a split between who we are and who we think we should be. In psychology, this gap creates what's called self-alienation, becoming a stranger to yourself. Elisabeth takes this to the extreme by creating Sue, her ideal self. We've all had moments where we thought, "I wish I looked different," or "Why can't I be younger or more attractive?" This movie takes those thoughts and makes them literal. Elisabeth sees aging as something to be ashamed of, and Sue is everything she thinks she's lost. But because they're essentially the same person, their hatred toward each other is just their self-hatred in disguise. They're trapped in what psychologists call a narcissistic cycle, unable to accept themselves as whole, complex beings with both strengths and limitations. Did you notice the mirrors everywhere in this movie? That's intentional, they're everywhere, and that's no accident. Mirrors symbolize self-perception, the way we look at ourselves, which is often distorted. Psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan describes something called the mirror stage, where babies first recognize themselves in a mirror. This moment creates our first sense of identity, but it's also our first experience of alienation, because we're seeing ourselves from the outside. Elisabeth is constantly comparing herself to her younger reflection. In a dramatic scene, she even covers up mirrors so she won't see herself. This shows us how obsessed she's become with how society sees her. The climax happens in a hall of mirrors where Elisabeth and Sue fight, shattering images of themselves. It's literally showing Elisabeth's internal battle between who she really is and who society expects her to be. These mirrors aren't just showing Elisabeth's physical appearance, they're reflecting how society has taught her to see herself. In a culture obsessed with youth, Elisabeth has learned to view aging as failure. The mirrors force her to confront this painful gap between her real self and her ideal self. One of the most powerful psychological concepts at work in The Substance is what Carl Jung called the shadow self. In simple terms, the shadow represents aspects of ourselves that we reject, repress, or deny. It contains traits, desires, and impulses that we've been taught are unacceptable or shameful. Sue isn't just Elisabeth's younger self, she's Elisabeth's shadow made flesh. She embodies the vitality, sexuality, and ambition that Elisabeth has suppressed to conform to Hollywood's expectations. When Sue parties, flirts, and pursues fame without restraint, she's expressing impulses that Elisabeth has long denied herself. What makes Jung's concept of the shadow so insightful is his warning. The more we repress our shadow, the more powerful and destructive it becomes. This is exactly what happens in the film. As Elisabeth tries to control Sue, limiting her freedom and sabotaging her diet, Sue grows increasingly rebellious and resentful. When Elisabeth finally attempts to destroy Sue with the termination serum, she discovers she can't. "Because I need you," she admits. This reflects Jung's wisdom that we can't simply eliminate our shadow. We need to integrate it. The shadow contains not just our darkness, but also our vitality, creativity, and authentic desires. The Substance also tackles addiction head-on. Elisabeth becomes hooked on the drug, following a typical addiction cycle: excitement, loss of control, and severe consequences. Extracting the fluid from her spine is painful and self-destructive, symbolizing how addiction can ruin your life. Sue represents the high, the temporary escape that feels amazing but ultimately destroys you. There's a brilliant Reddit comment that sums this up perfectly. "Your present self decides to go out drinking. You curse the person you were last night for their poor decisions, but both are still you." That's exactly what's happening between Elisabeth and Sue. They're one person divided across time, each blaming the other for their shared suffering. Elisabeth and Sue's relationship perfectly illustrates this cycle of blaming yourself and trying to escape reality. What makes this addiction particularly tragic is that it's driven by self-hatred. Elisabeth isn't just seeking pleasure, she's trying to escape her own identity. The Substance promises validation in a world that's rejected her, which makes it nearly impossible to resist. The movie isn't just about Elisabeth's personal struggles, it's also a criticism of society. Elisabeth's self-hatred doesn't emerge in a vacuum. It's manufactured by a culture that says a woman's value is her youth and beauty. Harvey, her sleazy producer, symbolizes society's harsh judgment, especially against older women. Harvey, the producer who fires Elisabeth, represents what psychoanalysts call the big other, the impersonal authority of social norms that judges us all. His dismissal reflects real-world ageism in entertainment, where women face diminishing opportunities as they age while men often peak later in life. Sue's fame from provocative fitness videos highlights how society objectifies women's bodies. When Sue performs for Harvey's approval, she's internalizing what feminist film theorist Laura Mulvey called the male gaze, seeing herself through men's eyes. She starts seeing herself only through the eyes of others, especially men, which is exactly what society pushes women to do. The film suggests that self-hatred is actually a social sickness, perpetuated by industries that profit from insecurity. From cosmetic surgery to anti-aging creams to social media filters, Entire economies thrive on convincing women they need fixing. The substance is just an extreme version of products we encounter every day. The shocking final scene, where Elisabeth and Sue fuse into a monstrous creature, shows the extreme result of completely rejecting parts of yourself. In psychological terms, this represents fragmentation, a complete collapse of a clear sense of who you are. The monster becomes a twisted metaphor for the impossible pursuit of perfection. With multiple faces and deformed limbs, it represents the fragmented self pushed to its extreme, unable to recognize itself, consumed by self-hatred. This disturbing image forces viewers to confront the damage done by these standards and how we all play a part in creating them. The monster is saying, "You created me. Now witness the consequences." The substance leaves us with an important message. Rejecting yourself will ultimately destroy you. Elisabeth's real tragedy isn't that she's aging, it's that she can't accept herself as she is. Psychologists talk about integration as the goal of healthy development, bringing together all aspects of ourselves, even the parts we find difficult to accept. Elisabeth and Sue represent the opposite, disintegration. They cannot embrace their wholeness, so they destroy each other instead. The movie challenges us to rethink societal pressures that encourage self-hatred. Imagine a world where aging isn't seen as losing value, but as gaining experience. Imagine accepting all of yourself with compassion instead of judgment. In a powerful, gruesome way, the substance reminds us that the real horror isn't aging or imperfection. It's living in a society that makes us hate ourselves just for being human.